I was curious at the time because I was just starting my PhD work. I was trying to, I actually wrote a few blog posts about like, how is this going to impact education and this end of what we're
Mm-hmm.
doing on social media? Because it'll come, but I can't see it, right? Because I couldn't see that people would, be writing a sponsored post um, for Pearson textbooks, or some people would, but like most
Right,
people you wanted to read probably wouldn't be. What I
right,
hadn't foreseen was the ways in which Silicon Valley would see so much value in the public money behind education that the ed tech tools themselves would become these spaces of kind of capitalism enclosing education. So the tools themselves become the things that you can't escape, right?
Part of my goal with this podcast is to highlight Canadian educational leaders from right across the country. And sometimes it's difficult to find somebody in every single province. But today I have somebody who's technically from Prince Edward Island, although she's not living there today. But I'm going to check that box and say we have someone from Prince Edward Island. And that someone is Bonnie Stewart, Dr. Bonnie Stewart. And Dr. Bonnie Stewart is one of those people that you are just grateful to know, because she is wonderfully smart, pushes your thinking, also very funny, which that helps too. And her and I have just connected and stayed connected over the past decade or so, along with her husband, Dave Cormier, who I think the two of them I kind of consider the dynamic duo of Canadian ed tech. So grateful to know them both. And today's conversation really revolves around kind of the place that social media may or may not have in educators today. And both her and I were early adopters and found great success in forging networks and communities in various spaces. And today, not so much. And as both teachers of pre-service teachers, we are wrestling with what does that look like to help young teachers find a network, which was invaluable for both of us and still is invaluable. We've just been fortunate to be on the good side of connecting. So just a great conversation around that and getting her insights and thoughts on what has happened and what may happen in the future. Today's conversation is brought to you by Advanced Learning Partnerships. We serve communities right across North America, serving in all kinds of capacities, talking about these kinds of difficult issues, other things as well. But I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Dr. Bonnie Stewart. And we start off with a little bit of trivia. If you're from Prince Edward Island, you have to have some affiliation with Anne of Green Gables, and indeed Bonnie does. So enjoy that and the rest of the conversation I have with Bonnie Stewart. I honestly still think about you and your role as what's her name? Not Anne, but you
Diana
were
Barry. That was me.
Diana. You were Diana Barry. And every
My
time I see you, I think about Diana Barry. So maybe just as a quick introduction to the podcast, like tell me about your history with as Diana Barry and growing up, because you grew up in PEI, did you not?
I did.
Like, what was that like in this idyllic, romantic place that at least that's how the outsiders perceive it?
Sure. Well, anytime that you live in a place that is doing a good job of selling itself as a tourism destination, you are automatically sort of living both sides of that idyllic presentation. I grew up in PEI. I spent most of my teenage and early summer jobs in one end or another of the Anne of Green Gables industry because I did not take French immersion and therefore was not eligible for the better paid government jobs. And I had no real physical skills, and there's no industry in PEI. So it was put a bow in your hair and put on puff sleeves and shimmy for the tourists. There were a great many things about that were demeaning, but also I really actually loved Anne of Green Gables growing up. Had to take a break after that series of sort of my teens and early 20s. By the time that I had like 2 degrees and I was still putting the puff sleeves on to make $5 an hour, I got a little jaded and actually took up smoking briefly for a period so I could sit outside the Anne of Green
Wow,
Gables store on my
Diana,
literally.
Diana.
Literally, I took great pleasure in sitting out. This was the 90s, in sitting out there on my smoke break with the puff sleeves on. I'm not saying it was the best coping mechanism, but then after a 20-year break, I basically left PEI at 17, couldn't get off the island fast enough, wanted to see bigger places, would still go home in the summer and work in the Anne of Green Gables industry, but lived out west, up north, in Asia, in Europe, for about 15 years. And then in my 30s, when I was kind of ready to have kids, like so many islanders, and I think so many people from regional and small places do, felt that real pull to move home.
Right.
And so ended up raising my kids for their childhood in Prince Edward Island. And they ended up not starring, they ended up as ensemble members in the Charlottetown Festival's Anne of Green Gables musical, which felt like um, sort of a strange full circle.
Uh-huh.
Anyhow, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, well, and I'm always, like, it's always curious, right? Like, but I think to your point, even, and it's not maybe to the same magnitude, but similar here in small town Saskatchewan. Half of our kids, they went out east. They were gonna conquer the world in Toronto and all kind, and then said, you know what? It's maybe not a bad idea to come live in a smaller town and sort of appreciate it. So there's that kind of duality that I think exists for a lot of people growing up. But um, and PEI has, so many more little known charms, if you will, that attract that tourism. So always fascinated to hear what it's like from that. And I know you still have family in there, but beyond that, you during your, and I think it's probably during your 30s, as you sort of began to be, you were always a smart person, but unofficially a smart person because you had like all these fancy degrees and so forth. um, you turned your attention to looking at social media, and I wanted to, and then this is kind of the key reason I wanted to talk with you today is, um, what sort of drew you to that as something that I think I'd like to devote some time studying this and understanding this better. So what was the draw for you?
great question. It's so funny to look back on social media as I experienced it, 14, 15 years ago, and even um, begin to put that into words because it literally felt like an entirely different experience than it does now, I think. Um, I had been back in PEI in my 30s, working kind of year to year type staff jobs at the university. I had a master's degree. I wanted to do a PhD, but had not uh, really been in a place where it was accessible. There were not a lot of online PhD programs at that time. We had little kids. We couldn't just pick up and move. And then my university did open a PhD program. At the time that they opened it, and it was a PhD in education, which was my field, I had been working in aspects of online and digital education for a pretty solid decade at that point, in and out, on and off. Um, and was interested, had come into digital education from a perspective of working in an office of open learning and distance ed during my master's degree in my late 20s, and had learned about sort of the concept of open sharing. And open at that point was still being used mostly in terms of like the open university sense in the
Right.
UK, where the goal was widening participation to folks from different walks of life and different experiences. And I found real value in that as somebody who was a first in family university attender, who had worked teaching GED and those kinds of educational opportunities and some adult ed at a community college. I was excited by what open learning offered. And at that point in the late 90s, when I had started in that office during my master's, they were just branching out from sort of the TV version of distance ed and the
Mm-hmm.
conference call, like literally on landlines version of distance ed, to early use of computers to kind of create these spaces using what we would now call learning management systems. So I'd been interested in that. And then in the period where we had moved back to PEI and had kids, was also blogging, and had discovered a community of really frank and honest writers working their way through um, the identity challenges and the monotony and the love of early parenthood, and was also kind of predominantly through my partner who was doing early podcasting, in education, had my foot both in the blogging community and the education community online, and as spaces like um, Twitter evolved, I was really interested in how something like social media could be used to build community, particularly in for like teachers or for educators. So I started when I started my PhD. I thought, well, I would really like to see how this super participatory medium, right, where I had this wonderful experience of having my writing received and commented on, and I would see a comment and then click the link, and like the hyperlinks would take me to that person's blog, and then a lot of those relationships got ported um, onto Twitter. And on Twitter, I was finding access to voices in education that were outside of my experience, particularly because I come from Eastern Canada, which in my growing up and at that point was, um, my world had still been pretty white. And Twitter gave me access to seeing the ways in which um, racialized educators talked about education, and all of it kept kind of broadening my understanding of what I was doing. And I was really excited about this world where you could have access to how other people perceived things. You could learn while watching. You could also learn by engaging. And I found it a really rich sort of almost 24/7 professional development space in those early days of like 2008, 2009, 2010. And so I thought I would go in and study that. As I did, and by the time that I got to the point where I was doing my study, we were into 2012, 2013, and Twitter really started to change. So I ended up doing my study right at the point where um, I think there was a positive development where the capacity for um, hashtag activism became super visible. And people could band together across interests from really people who didn't know each other and people from different locales and whatever. Um, and I saw that happen. And then almost immediately on top of it, what was initially called more like call out culture, which was the capacity to pile on and push for a particular accountability often. But then that has kind of since been weaponized into what often gets referred to now as like cancel culture. And so many of the capacities that early networked space allowed, taken to their logical conclusion, have turned out to be kind of shit. Can I say shit?
Yeah. 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 Well,
They've
it's
turned
yeah.
out
I
to be
mean,
kind of shit.
well, tragedy of the commons is the one I think about a lot when it comes to the space, and I think you and I, uh, our timelines are similar in terms of our engagement with social media, and my my perceptions are just that. My perceptions and yours are obviously a little bit more sophisticated and actually researched as opposed to just my feeling. But you are, I mean, articulate. And it's difficult when you talk to young, well, not such young people, but people who are new to social media. And when I say new, I say didn't really start in until maybe, 5 or 7 years ago. But
Yes.
that sort of pre 2012 ish, if you will, so maybe
Mhm.
5 years of that was for me a very playful time. It was just a bunch
Yeah.
of people who like, hey, it's like kids showing up to the playground and parents weren't around, and it's like, what are we gonna do here? Like, well, there's no
Mhm.
adults here, so let's just play. Like, you want to play this game? I learned how to play this. Like, and when and I've seen that happen, and I recall it as a kid, but now more recently with grandkids, when they show up to the playground and like another kid comes in, and just watching them how they negotiate play, and like how will we be together, like what are we going to do, and
Yeah.
most times it's actually quite lovely to watch people negotiate how we're going to interact, and then their curiosity around, oh, where do you go to school and what do you do, and really mirrored what that was like. And to your point around, you know I grew up in rural prairies, and it was white. It was what it was. It was very narrow. That was my world. This is all I don't know people who have different identities and backgrounds and contexts. So it was wonderful to learn with and from other people. And I just felt so blessed to feel like, hey, I know somebody that lives in New York City who is,
Yeah.
a person of color who like deals with all kinds of stuff. Like, I don't even really understand it, but I'm curious. Right. And then, I think about that 2012. And then from my perspective, what I experienced was I saw people thinking, oh, I can now leverage this space to promote myself, to do things that was like, well, okay, that's not, I mean, that was my experience. It was like, now you're using this place to promote yourself in a lot of cases. And I thought you were just we were and it changed from, now you see how many likes people have, you see how many followers. You didn't have that at the beginning. You had no idea. Everybody was sort of this, we're all the same, and who knows, like, like, I don't know if you're like, every once in a while I'd find out somebody that I connected with, oh, this person's actually kind of a big deal, I didn't even know that, right?
Yeah.
But now it became like leveraged, and so I saw that trend. And then feel like the 2016, that was where the political side of things really took off, in largely a negative way. And now you have politicians and so forth, trying to really polarize people, and that worked. And then now I don't even know what it is now. Like, now I'm so confused about it. But I feel like it's hard. Like, it's like telling young people, well, there were a good old days, and they were kind of the good old days. Like that. Like, I know it's biased, but they really were. There was just much more of a purity of, like, we're just people trying to figure something out. Like, that's all we were.
It was a lot less stratified, and I think it was maybe it was Clay Shirky in that time who talked about it as like
Mm-hmm.
a place for people's surplus
Right.
labor energy. But it was
Cognitive
very
surplus,
much,
right?
yeah, it was the place where people went to do things outside of kind of the established stratification. I'm sure that there were people who probably still had negative experiences of
Sure.
feeling excluded, et cetera, in that space. I don't mean that it was idealized or perfect, but it was largely a public and a commons where there was a lot of goodwill and good faith extended. And the space had not been captured to pit us against each other at that point, right? Um, I think that two things happened. One was like I mentioned, sort of the development of the capacity to band together, which is powerful, but
Mm-hmm.
also then in its um, when you have spaces designed fully to support that can lead to a lot of then creation of things like bots that can make the appearance of a mob when there isn't even a mob. We've had all of those affordances or capacities that have been captured and weaponized. Also, even before 2012, starting like 2009 or so, I saw it first in the mommy blogging world. You saw the monetization of spaces, right? So
Mm-hmm.
somebody who used to write a pretty honest post about how crap it was to be awake at 3 a.m., knowing that you still had to get up and go to work in 3 hours, suddenly was writing a sponsored Sunbeams post about craft dinner. And you're like,
Right.
really? Really, Karen?
Yeah.
I don't buy the sort of the vibe there.
Yeah.
And I was curious at the time because I was just starting my PhD work. I was trying to. I actually wrote a few blog posts about like how is this going to impact education and this end of what we're
Mm-hmm.
doing on social media because it'll come, but I can't see it, right? Because I couldn't see that people would, be writing a a sponsored post. For Pearson textbooks, or some people would, but like most
Right.
people you wanted to read probably wouldn't be. What I
Right.
hadn't foreseen was the ways in which Silicon Valley would see so much value in the public money behind education that the ed tech tools themselves would become these spaces of kind of capitalism enclosing education. So the tools themselves become the things that you can't escape, right? And that, now with AI and the work that I'm doing in like the data stuff, the data extraction underneath all the tools we're using, it's made me much more wary of even bringing my own students who are training to be teachers onto as many platforms as I
Right.
used to because I can't really tell them what's happening to their data. It's not designed to be transparent to users. It's not designed for the good of the users or for participatory use. It's designed to make profit.
Well, and that's what I wanted a specific question, because I felt the same, and I felt this, like, it's funny you mentioned 2012. um and I don't know that I had any kind of a marker there, but I know that prior to that, and that was when I was working at the district level, I was advocating for everybody, like, you people have to check out blogging. You have to check out
Yeah.
these social media spaces because there's so many wonderful people there. And whether you just watch what's going on, whether you engage, uh, like it was just all rainbows and unicorns. Like, it really
Mhm.
was. Again, maybe I'm not saying there weren't anybody that was having a negative experience, but
Yep.
my experience was very, very positive, and I wanted others to experience it. Come 2012, and I'm still teaching undergrads. I became, just because of some of the changes, I just sort of tempered my enthusiasm and advocacy for it. It's like, yeah, there's some good stuff there, but it was also a lot of work at that time, because now it
Mhm.
became like, even if it wasn't so much negative, it was like, in order to build a network, like, you have to actually invest a lot of time. And you and I both would admit we invested a lot of time in those early years, and not because we said, oh, I got it was just fun, right? All of a sudden, oh, now I'm and I always kind of talked about collecting smart people. Oh, there's a smart person, I'm going to connect with them, and there's a smart person. It's like,
Yep.
that was what it was for me again. And I just felt like that became harder to do as these spaces grew, even without
Yep. It did.
some of the structural changes. Just the size, the scale of it was like hard to wrap your head around. And if you were gonna blog, you had to figure out, if I actually want to have engagement, I've got to invest in other people, right? I can't just, I mean, it's like becoming a friend. You couldn't just come to the playground again and say,
Yep.
someone be my friend. You have to be a friend to other people, so you had to go
Yep.
invest time reading other people, and honestly and authentically connecting with them, if you actually wanted them to provide you any kind of feedback. And as that went along, and then probably again in that 2016 era, it was like, I didn't even like, you know what, if you don't feel like you need to have a social media presence, don't.
Yep.
And I
No.
wonder what you, and I know so I'd love for you just to maybe, I don't know, speculate, expand on, like, is there still a future for social media, and or what, if not, what can we do to give our current and future educators opportunities to find community um, online?
Let me warm up the crystal ball. I don't know what the future is. I know that with regrets, I have moved away just in the last year from taking my pre-service teaching classes onto Twitter, even after sort of the even after 2016, even though there were bots everywhere, even I understood how social media could be used for misinformation, and I also understood how pylons could happen, but I felt competent and capable of bringing my students who are training to be teachers, and my job is to teach them educational technology. And there was still a really vibrant education focused, particularly hashtag chat focused community on Twitter. And I would sometimes partner with colleagues. For a couple of years, we did hashtag chats as part of the Equity Unbound hashtag with Mahab Ali and Catherine Cronin. So in Egypt and Ireland, we would end up in chats with students in different countries talking about the same reading. And for the most part, those hashtags were not being particularly trolled or bombarded or flooded with bots. And so it felt like a reasonably safe space for me to talk to students about, look, I can't promise you that this is 100% safe. You need to be mindful and considerate that you are addressing, a public audience. You need to be mindful and considerate that there will be people there who have differing opinions from you, but this is a space where generally you can engage, and it's gonna be fast, but we're gonna just give this a shot, so they could really experience that kind of real time participatory engagement, right, where you're giving and receiving, and some of it's going to flow by you and you're going to miss it, and that's an important piece of learning as well, to just let that go, right? The goal is not online to get the whole thing, it's abundance, and
Hmm.
the goal is to make connections within what you do get. That remained viable and valuable to me until the last year, and once whatever the game that Elon Musk is playing, it is not in any way to protect or safeguard the user experience on Twitter. And so once some of those safeguards were taken off, I decided, look, I can't in good conscience ask my students to use it. So I took that out of my syllabus for this past year. And I'm considering this coming year. And while I myself am still on Twitter nominally as a legacy person, and it still has some uses that, for instance, Mastodon or Blue Sky cannot replace. Um, a lot of my actual conversation with people has moved to Mastodon, not really to Blue Sky. And I've also just really stopped having as many conversations,
Yeah.
which is a loss. But I can't bring my students onto Mastodon because there's
No,
not a critical mass of teachers there. I can't make the value proposition for them
that's
that
right.
this is going to, change your PD experience,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not at this point. It is great for early adopters like you or I, who have enough of a network of people that we can port over to a community like that and have people to talk to. And some of them, I've seen more of them on Mastodon than I had in the last 5 years on Twitter. Very best. Great.
Right.
But as a teaching piece, I try to build as much of that kind of almost like a walled garden of networked conversation in my classes, but it is not the
Right.
same.
No.
And it is largely a factor that the industry of edtech is not interested in building tools that transparently and safely support that kind of networked participatory engagement any longer. It is very interested in um, automating and extracting. And that's the enclosure of the comments.
And I think about, so I've got a colleague who started something, I think it's called K-12 Leaders. So it's a walled garden space. And I've gone there, but I don't know I don't know what it lacks that early. And again, maybe it's just my own fixed mindset around this is how I engage and how I want to engage, and it's not happening in
Mhm.
the same way. But the other thing that I just thought of, and I wondered what you thought. Like, as an advocate of blogging, and still I am. I don't know if it's not like Cog Dog style, just sticking with that really well. But I
Love
blog,
content.
I don't know, monthly or whatever it is, and I know I don't get the same level of engagement that I used to,
Yeah.
but I wonder about that as a space where I like the one thing about it, the safety of it is I own that space. Like
Mhm.
whoever comes on there, I let them. It's my house, right? I'll
Yep.
invite these people in. These people, you're not coming in.
Yep.
Um, and so it's not as it was never going to be as abundant as social spaces were, but the value of it, if I could find like five people who regularly would read what I wrote and regularly interact with me, like that was super valuable. And I also think about like the loss of RSS feeds. That used to be a thing where that was my morning routine. It was I'd go to my
Yeah.
RSS feed and see who's posted something new, which those things can still exist,
Yeah.
and they would be, I think, an amazing way to introduce uh, educators specifically, to building a community. There's a little more work involved with it and a little more investment in terms of like if you're going to blog like that, it's not like writing a 140K tweet about I had a sandwich for lunch, which was fine to do and in some cases led to some really good things. But I just wonder about the future of that because it's still there. And I mean, it's blogging is now, we're probably 25 years old or so that,
Mhm. And
and
blogging has been declared dead so many times over the last 15 years. Now, I myself have not blogged in 3 years. Something in the pandemic just kind of
yeah.
shriveled me, and I could no longer figure out what to say or who to say it to. I still have hopes of finding my voice again and returning to some level of writing in my own space because I do miss that. And also because you're absolutely right, there's huge value in having that domain of one's own, right? That space that is both yours in terms of who you let in, but as I've spent the last couple of years looking more at the what gets pulled out of the spaces we use, you also therefore are not entering into any terms of service that you don't
Hmm.
understand or any of those pieces. Like if you're using something like WordPress, then you can come to understand it. The terms of service aren't changing that much. You're able to understand kind of what's happening in that space, both input and output. And I think that that's really important. I had dropped blogging from my pandemic era online courses because onboarding students while they were online to a shared WordPress site just felt like a little bit of a bridge too far. I condensed my courses a
Hmm.
bit during that period,
Hmm.
but I am seriously considering bringing that back for this year. I would love to be able to teach about RSS. Here's the funny part. I am someone who has built a career as an educator who thinks about digital technologies. I'm not a techie, right? So I
Hmm.
loved Google Reader. I loved RSS back in the day. I think it's very interesting that Google Reader was one of the first things of the participatory things that was killed. And I
Yeah.
think it's partly because again there was a probably an active decision not to move in that kind of direction because it's it's not profitable. It is communal. But RSS is great. I'm also aware that most of my students are not in my class so that they can learn technically to build their own RSS
Right.
feed. There are probably two that might be interested, and I can mention RSS and direct them to the YouTube videos that will show them how to do it. But even if I led everyone to that water, it's not going to make them drink. Because again, it's about
Yeah.
establishing that people are in people who are taking 10 courses at once in a bachelor of education program are there to learn the tools that they understand have cachet and currency. Um, and it's hard to make that case for RSS.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
no question. Yeah, and I mean, it's funny because I mean, again, it's like, okay, so the value that I want people to understand is that there's huge value in having a network. Like,
yeah.
and again, I think, Stephen Downs has always done such a good job of distinguishing between networks and communities. They're different things.
Mhm.
There's overlap,
There.
but they are different things. Um, and to hear people who have successfully been able to build a network and the value that they've gained from that is it's really compelling. But it also is like, it's kind of complicated, and now it's even more complicated because of all of the challenges that you've addressed. So it's would be very hard if you're a
Yeah.
brand new educator today to actually build a nice, sustainable network of people that you can reach out to and say, hey, I don't know how to do this thing, help me do a thing. Right? Like, and that's, I still have that to a degree. Like, I have people that I can, I mean, and yet there are, you look around at TikTok and other places, and there's still seemingly good humans on there trying to share
Mhm.
um, interesting and useful content. And so it's like, I'm still compelled, like, oh, there's a person, like, even if they are monetizing it to some degree, you still get a sense of, yeah, but what you're sharing, I like that. I like what
Mhm.
you're teaching me how to do this thing, and I can learn a thing from you. And maybe if I asked a question, you would actually respond to me. But um,
It's true. It's true,
yeah,
and I think that it's funny because when I first learned about, like, online networks, right? When I was doing it and starting to do some reading around it and understand what the hell I was doing, and that, and again, the distinction that Stephen Downs made between groups and networks was instrumental in me coming to understand that the networks that we were engaging in, probably mutually at that time, were largely based on, like, vaguely common interests, but mostly having fun. They weren't serious. They weren't even
yeah,
really like, this is my content, this is my brand. Um, I thought of networking as a verb at that point as something that people who were not me were doing at the Chamber of Commerce. Um, where they were exchanging business cards and in a very instrumentalized
right.
way, building relationships, valuable, super to them. I wasn't interested in that instrumentalized relationship that's going to move me forward, which for me is, like, particularly what, like, LinkedIn has become. Um, uh, Not saying that there isn't value there, but I really liked networks that were not as instrumentalizing and as focused. Possibly because I'm not a very serious person, and I actually am
Well,
mostly
yeah.
interested in, like, here, have some good vibes, or whatever. I don't know, but there has definitely been that shift.
Yeah, it yeah, I mean, I think we're all kind of landing on the same place. Like, I don't know what's next. I don't know what to do. Like, what is it that we can do? Like, that's why, I mean, I've kind of turned to podcasting more, because it's like,
Yeah.
okay, now I can actually spend time with people. And I don't know, it's weird because it's, in some ways, it's more work than blogging is. But in other ways, it's like, kind of kills couple of birds that I'm trying to catch. One is, I get to talk and hang out with people that I want to hang out. So I pick them, and we chat. And then the second thing is, like, I share that with other people, and if they find it valuable or interesting, well, bonus, right? But even if they don't, even if not one person listens, like, I got to talk to Bonnie Stewart today, so I win. Um,
Which is
let me
very
just
nice. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So let me just shift a little bit of gear, just to one little kind of question, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. So when I started this podcast, my intent was to feature, to give people a sense of education across Canada. And
Mhm.
we differ from the US in that we have no national body that actually governs or provides any specific direction. It's all provincial. And so in that case, each province kind of has a little bit of its own identity. But having worked in almost all the provinces, like, there's more similarities than differences, but at the same time, I'm always curious, like, how does this differ from that? So as somebody, and again, I don't mind if you speak from this from a higher ed perspective or from K-12, whatever you want. But when you think about, okay, so now you've been in Ontario for 5 years, and there's
Yeah.
Ontario and there's PEI, like, how do you sort of like what would you say from an education perspective? I mean, certainly you're going from the largest province to the smallest, which in and of itself would have its own distinctions, but maybe even beyond the scale of it, like how do you sort of juxtapose the two?
Uh, it's taken me some time to get my mind around the scale of Ontario for sure. And I moved here about a year and a half before the pandemic. So I was just getting my head around who's who in the zoo. And then largely I like wasn't on my campus for 2 full years. My kids were barely in school for 2 full years. I do feel like in Ontario and in any large decentralized system, particularly when you are not at the center of it, and we don't live in Toronto, so we are not at the center of Ontario educationally. We don't live in a city where there's a Department of Education or Ministry of Education offices or anything like that. I do feel less aware and connected to kind of the thrust of things than I did in PEI. That was partly just the privilege of being in a very small place and living in the so-called capital city of 40,000 souls. Might be 45 now. But obviously you're going to have a lot more just personal and random connections to people who happen to be somewhat driving the system that you're in. That has not happened for us in Ontario. Same thing in higher ed. I understand my institution to an extent at this point. I was a liaison of for our university in a ministry committee early on where I met some folks from other universities, but that sense of being part of a whole is still a jigsaw puzzle that I'm putting together. I think one of the big differences for us in being here beyond that sense of scale in Ontario, since we got here, because I accepted the job here the day before Doug Ford announced that he was running for leadership of the PC party in Ontario. And so we arrived at a time when I keep hearing the terms world-class education system in the K to 12 sense. And but there has been from the provincial government both an active effort to um, let's say, minimize the power of one of the strongest unions in the country, the teachers union. Since we arrived, there have been active strikes. And then with the pandemic and all the disruptions, very much an anti-education approach from the government, from my perspective. And so there are a lot of testing pieces. We have EQAO that my ninth grader is going to be doing as a major standardized test that, as far as I can tell, a lot of money is spent, and I'm not sure what what good it actually does for the kids. There's a lot of that in this system, but I do not feel the same level of actual interest in what I would think of as educational values. But that is partly because of the time that I've been here, and it isn't.
Yeah.
I don't think it's reflective of Ontario so much as the time that we happen to be living through in it.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, let me get you out of here with some fun questions. I think they're,
Okay.
well, no, fun is a relative term too. Tell me something that you're currently reading or listening to that's kind of captured your attention.
I am reading a book by Sarah Rose Kavanagh, who's somebody I met on Twitter years ago, who's written a few books, but this one is called, just a second, I think I need to check. Yeah. It's called Mind Over Monsters, and it
Okay.
is a really smart and interesting take on sort of what we're calling the teen mental health crisis, what's happening societally that is driving so so many mental health challenges that kids are having. It very much focuses more on the mental health side than the mental illness side, and actually kind of
Hmm.
reflects that as a we have some societal problems that
Couple.
are hard
Couple.
for kids to navigate. I have teens myself, and so I'm finding that a really interesting deep dive into a topic near and dear to my heart.
Cool. What are you watching? Any and even guilty pleasures are okay.
I just finished watching The Ultimatum, Queer Love, or Queer Ultimatum, or what? It's a Netflix show with 10 lesbian and or non-binary persons paired off in 5 couples, one of whom has delivered the other an ultimatum that we need to get married. So they hang out for a week, pick other partners, live with those partners for 3 weeks, and then go back to their original partner and then decide if they've worked through their commitment issues. And it's really neat to take the direct gender piece out of it, although there's still a lot of like masculinity, femininity things operating in terms of those relationships. But it's candy. Great
Reality
fun.
TV. Hard to know anybody that doesn't find something in reality TV that catches their fancy. If I were to come to Windsor,
Hmm.
what would be the sort of hidden gem, or you should probably check this place out that you would advise people to go see or visit?
So I am enjoying Windsor. It's funny because most of the time when I hear people put on the spot say, tell us a good thing about Windsor, most people will say Detroit because we are
Sure.
literally across the river from Detroit. Um, I spent 2.5 years of my first 5 years here unable to get to Detroit because the border was closed. So that forced me into thinking about Windsor more as a standalone city. The thing that I would say is actually there is a really, really great community theater network here, not just a single community theater, but probably 5 or 6 active community theater troops, both kids and adults. And so there is always something to see or do. There's a lot of just kind of like weekend events to go to that both things from serious plays to musicals to drag shows. There's a lot going on here. So that I would take you out to something like that if you wanted to
Okay.
come.
And real quick, PEI, besides all the things I would see, like what's the thing that most people don't know about PEI that they should do that you wouldn't maybe find on the first Google search?
Ooh, the secret hidden gem of PEI. I think that PEI has been turning its shiny tourism face to the sun for so long that I'm not sure that I have an off the cuff, like, you should absolutely do this, but nobody will be there kind of thing.
Right.
I would say there is a roadside attraction on the main highway between the Confederation Bridge and Charlottetown called the Car Life Museum. It is easy to drive past it because it has like old, like Ponderosa style, like lettering on it and these weird, large metal sort of fairy tale characters outside made out of like iron, but mostly rusted away with like rebar sticking out where the arms of the giant kangaroo used to be. Um, and it was the it was the labor of love of a dude in the 60s who loved cars and collected. It has Elvis's pink Cadillac and tractors and all these different cars from different eras, kind of all jumbled together inside. But also, that dude died in 1979 and nothing has changed in the entire
Nice.
place. So it's also a museum to the old dude. Um, the gumballs, the last time I was there, were also from 1979. It had all melted in the gumball machine.
Gee.
So it is, if you like a
Okay.
truly almost like visiting another time roadside attraction, Car Life Museum.
All right. It's on my list. Well, thank you so much for your time. Always, this was just nice chatting. You can, if you want to say hi to Dave, you can. If not, that's okay. You don't have to say hi to
Dave says
Dave.
hi to you. He already told me to. It is great to talk to you.
Right. I should probably have him on the show too, but I had to have you first, so I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
You take care.
Okay.